Prime Minister Jorinda, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, it's a pleasure for me to be invited to this Congress and speak about Europe's current crisis. It is also a great pleasure that my institute has been asked by the Croatian Statehood Foundation, represented by Mr. Kruzina, to participate in developing a program for the recovery of the Croatian economy. We have assembled quite a number of excellent researchers from my institute, the IFO Institute, to do this job. We will speak about fiscal policy, legal reforms, the necessity of maintaining a functioning welfare state, and the difficult path of transition from communism to a market economy. These proposals are not meant to be only for one party. And of course, we do not expect everything to be followed. But these are ideas which we want to present to the Croatian society, and then the public discourse in Croatia will have to pick those elements which they find suitable. But we are in the middle of the process, and so please do not expect me today to speak about this. The agreement was for this conference that I speak about another topic, namely the European crisis. It would be too early and premature to anticipate the results of a report which has not yet been written, and everything which I say could be misinterpreted and could be given too much weight relative to what the final proposals would be. So please allow me to come to my topic, the European crisis. The European crisis is a lesson also for Croatia, because if you understand what went wrong, it may help the country to avoid similar mistakes. These are ugly pictures which we have seen during the crisis. It shows the tensions in Europe, mass unemployment in Greece, mass unemployment in Spain. Radical political parties are coming to power. That is everything else but what we expected from the introduction of the euro. And I will speak today about the content of a book of mine that came out in the last summer by Oxford University Press, Eurotrack. My questions are we now on the right track? How did all this mess occur? The bursting bubble, then the loss of competitiveness for the southern European countries, and my policy proposals. Concerning the question of whether Europe has recovered, southern Europe has recovered, one often refers to the current account balance, which is basically the excess of exports over imports and interest payments to foreign creditors. Here you see that it went to minus 200 billion for the 6 crisis countries: Greece, Ireland, Portugal, Spain, Italy, and Cyprus. I call them gypsy. Things improved radically during the crisis, and we are now on the plus side. That is often seen as a sign that everything has been overcome, all the difficulties have been overcome. But this is certainly not true. First of all, one forgets that the policy of reducing the interest rates to 0 has improved the current account enormously if we correct for that and calculate with interest rates which the countries had to pay by the end of 2007, this would be the curve. And you see, we would still have some deficit. Still, things have improved. Why have they improved? Let's look at two countries, for example. Here you see Greece. The recovery of exports in Greece is there, but it is very limited. What you see, however, is that imports left their trends and imports have collapsed. The same you see in Spain. Yes, there is some recovery of exports, but primarily it is the collapse of imports which has improved the current account. And this shows that it is not really a recovery of competitiveness, it is simply the collapse of the economy. The mass unemployment means people have no income and can't afford foreign imports. That's all. As soon as Spain would recover, the current account deficits would return. What about the unemployment rates? Germany, for comparison, 10 years ago, Germany had its own difficulties, and the Schröder government carried out major reforms in the labor market to improve the situation. But here, for comparison, France. France has twice as much unemployment as Germany. Here, other countries. Ireland is improving. But look at Italy, an upward rising trend of unemployment. Or Portugal, yes, some improvement, but high rate. And here we have Spain and we have Greece. 25% rate of unemployment. Again, I don't want to talk about Croatia, but if you had in Croatia, it would be number 3 with its rate of unemployment among the European countries. So 25% rate of unemployment is quite a catastrophe and something which is not tolerable. Manufacturing output in the advanced economies, it's not yet back to the pre-crisis level worldwide. In the emerging countries, there is growth throughout. Here is Germany. It just managed to reach the pre-crisis level. But here come our European crisis countries. Portugal, it's down by 12%. France is down by 17%. And here is your country, down by 20% relative to the pre-crisis level. But Italy is worse, much worse. And Italy, as you see here, had a triple dip recession. The ball came down, went up, went down, went up a little bit. 2013 seemed to be the year when the crisis was over, but it wasn't over. Then came the ugly year 2014, when Italy was again in a slight recession. And this is Greece, and this is Spain, very similar performance. Spain is often acclaimed as a country that really has solved its problems. You see here, believe your eyes, it has not really solved the problems. There is a sideward move. In Spain, we had a double dip depression, and everyone has to be afraid that it does not become a triple dip depression. So that's the truth. Only one country succeeded of the crisis group. That is Ireland, for reasons I will explain. Ireland had an increase in 20% industrial output, manufacturing output in the last year. Why did all this mess happen? There was a bubble which the euro brought, and that burst. Here you see the interest rates for government bonds from 1985 until now. Here you see one date which is important. This is the irrevocable fixation of conversion rates in 2008, in 1998, sorry, in May of that year. And here you have the Madrid summit in 1995, December. You see, for those countries participating in the first wave of the euro, there was a perfect interest convergence within only 2 years. And one country I forgot, that is Greece. You see the Greek interest rates came down from 25% to something like 5% when they joined. They joined a little bit later, as you know, but when it was clear that they would participate, the rates came down. Why did they come down? Because investors were no longer afraid of losing their money because of an exchange rate risk. The exchange rate risk disappeared every day a little bit further when we approached this May 1998, where the exchange rates were irrevocably fixed. And for Greece, 2001, when they really joined the Eurozone. There was this period where everything seemed to work fine, interest rates were low, and it was very tempting to borrow. In Greece, the government borrowed to increase the wages in the government sector, and the private sector had to follow. The wages increased faster than productivity, which implied a high rate of inflation, depriving Greece of its competitiveness. In Spain, it was private people who borrowed to buy real estate, so there was a real estate boom. Construction workers found more jobs, the union could increase the wages, and it was basically the same story. There was a credit-driven wage increase beyond productivity, which inflated the Spanish economy and deprived Spain of its competitiveness. But then came the crisis. It began in America. Our banks in Europe had lost equity capital, they became more risk-averse, and all of a sudden they required higher rates of interest and shied away from continuing to finance Southern Europe. And the spreads exploded, and then since 2012 they came down again with the policies of the ECB, the whatever it takes of Mario Draghi, for example, which was a free of charge insurance against the default of countries, and that calmed the capital market. Though not Greece. Greece has now spreads over Germany of 10%, and it is unable to find any finance in the capital market. This is why I do not understand Yanis Varoufakis when he says he does not want to continue receiving funds from the EU. I mean, he has no alternative. There is no one who is willing to lend money to him, except other states at favorable conditions. The property prices show the same. Here you see Ireland. They went from 30 to 110, and then even before Lehman, the bubble burst, and the prices came down again. Here is Greece. Here is Spain. You see this enormous explosion of property prices, which obviously went too far and was then corrected. Or here's Cyprus. Italy. Portugal. And even France had a bubble, but the French bubble, for reasons we can discuss, has not yet burst. And this is Germany. Germany didn't have a bubble. We had slightly declining house prices, and only now in the crisis do house prices go up. It's all normalized such that at the time of Lehman, these values become 100. So the levels do not matter. It's only the time period. There was an enormous loss of competitiveness through the credit bubble, which you can see here. This is the so-called real exchange rate. It's the price index of GDP relative to the rest of the Eurozone. You see Spain. Spain went up from 80 to 100. They had a 25% price increase relative to the rest of the Eurozone because of this credit bubble. and that deprived them of their competitiveness. They have to come down again because no one is willing to finance Spain anymore. They would have to go down to the 18, but maybe even more. This is what they did. They devalued by 6% during the crisis. Yes, there was the back gear, but they would have to go here. They would have to come down below the 80 because of the enormous foreign debt which the country built up during the crisis. 1,000 billion euros external debt, which is as much as all the other crisis countries taken together, including Italy. This is Greece. A similar story, an appreciation as if they had still the drachma and appreciated it enormously, destroying the competitiveness. They have to come down, they did come down, but here is where they would have to go. And here are the other countries. I picked through France, Italy, Ireland, and here Germany. Germany is the country which became cheaper and cheaper and cheaper relative to the others. Not because it cut its prices, but because it was not inflating like the others. It's all relative. In order for the whole system to rebalance, Germany would have to inflate now by 30% relative to the rest, and the others would have to come down by 30% or so relative to the rest, and then everything would be fine. It's a big task. It is a task of a decade or two within the euro. Why did Ireland do it? You see, Ireland had this enormous decline already from 2006 onward. That's when the Irish bubble burst, and they came down by 15%. That is the largest real devaluation of all countries. And remember, Ireland had this enormous success in industrial output. Why did they do it? They did it because no one helped them. In 2006, 2007, there was no program by the other EU countries. There was no program by the ECB to help Ireland. And therefore, they had to tighten their belts, reduce their wages and prices, and they became competitive. All the other countries came into the crisis simultaneously after Lehman, and they thought, rather than repeating the Irish path, we could print the money which we can't borrow anymore. And with the majority they had in the ECB Council, it was possible to reduce the collateral requirements for banks drawing credit from the local printing presses, and that helped them to seemingly overcome the crisis. But it has not improved their competitiveness since. Here you see a useful comparison when you look at labor costs per hour. These are the Eastern European countries. You see Croatia there. And here you see the 6 crisis countries. They all are basically more expensive. Compare here Poland with Greece. Greece is twice as expensive as Poland. Their workers would have to be twice as productive as the Polish workers for this to be compatible with an equilibrium. But I tell you, their productivity is not comparable to the Polish one. I don't know how high it is. I would be surprised if it was more than 50%. That is the fundamental difficulty which we have now in the Eurozone. Some countries are overpriced. And nothing what politicians in the EU may proclaim or dream will be able to solve this problem. No program of Mr. Juncker, nothing is able to solve this problem. It is a long and painful adjustment process, which will now take place, in which we are actually. We have seen that for a couple of years now, and it will last for many additional years until Eastern European countries have grown sufficiently with their wages to make Southern Europe competitive. And here compare Spain and Poland. Spain is 3 times as expensive as Poland. They would need a labor productivity 3 times as high as Poland. No way. There are now 4 dismal options. I'm coming from a dismal science, so allow me to speak about 4 dismal options. The first is we create a transfer union. That is, we provide more and more credit and convert the credit gradually into outright transfers over time. But that's not so useful for the recipient countries either, because they are in a permanent Dutch disease. When the Netherlands found gas and sold the gas in the world, they had lots of money to increase the wages beyond productivity, and that killed parts of the Dutch export industry. It's called Dutch disease. East Germany is in a permanent Dutch disease situation. The Italian Mezzogiorno is in a permanent Dutch disease situation. The next is we deflate the periphery or Southern Europe through austerity. But that's very painful because there are lots of creditors who are over-indebted. You cannot cut the wages and prices, you drive them into bankruptcies and you have mass unemployment and insolvency. The third is we inflate Germany. That's a possibility which would help Southern Europe to regain its competitiveness, but we would have to inflate it quite a bit, about 60% relative to today, relative to the rest of the Eurozone. And it's a question whether the German population will accept it. Anyway, the QE program of the ECB moves in this direction. It wants to inflate the Eurozone to help the alignment of relative prices. It is possibly alleviating the pain, and it is a little contribution, but if it goes too far, it will be a problem. And then we have only the possibility of exits. But exits are ugly, as we have seen in the case of Cyprus. We will have bank runs, we will have capital controls, and you don't have a free capital market anymore. We now have 2 euros, as you know. We have 1 in prison in Cyprus and 1 in freedom in the rest, and the exchange rate is not 1-to-1. The first of these possibilities thus far has been chosen. As you see in the Greek case, we give one program after the other, and we talk about reduction of interest rates to 0 actually for 10%. So gradually the credit mutates to an outright transfer. Overall, this is a summary of the rescue operations which the European countries have chosen. First of all, there was extra money from the printing press in the 6 crisis countries, 1,002 billion euros of extra refinancing credit coming from the local central banks. Money which was used to continue buying goods abroad and redeeming the debt in other countries. Then there were the outright programs. For example, the S&P program, buying the government bonds of the crisis countries. These are the purchases by non-GIPSIC countries, 132 billion. Then the programs for Greece, which sum up to 148. Then we have Ireland, then we have Portugal, and so on. It was a total of 1,339 billion euros of rescue credits, of which 17% were controlled by parliaments through direct decisions, and 38% were decided by the ECB Council. The majority of the rescue operations was decided by the ECB Council, which is a technocratic body. It bailed out the bankrupt states and banks in Southern Europe. And then, of course, we have the ONT program, which doesn't show up in numbers, which is a free-of-charge insurance against the default. So if an investor buys a Spanish government bond, he can be sure that he will get his money back, because before Spain goes bankrupt, they would go into the ESM, and then the ECB would buy the government bonds from the investor, and he would escape. It's an insurance which you could also buy in the market as a CDS. Let me talk about this country briefly. You know what happened here. Mrs. Merkel was a little bit reluctant, but in the end they fought together. This is the Greek foreign debt. This is the money which they borrowed from the printing press. 76 billion euros in total by now. The numbers go up recently. It's a huge capital flight with refinancing the printing press. And this is the credits, the fiscal credits from other states. So Greece in total has received 290 billion euros by the end of January this year from public sources of the rest of the EU. Compare this with what happened, or what the level was at the beginning of 2010, 5 years ago. We had the first Brexit debate. I remember that still very well. Then the credit was 48 billion. Now we have increased it by a factor of 6, nearly 6-fold. And still the crisis is lingering on. With money, you can just postpone the crisis. You cannot improve the competitiveness. To the contrary, you reduce the efforts in the respective country to solve the problem with necessary reforms. Actually here, this is the total net foreign debt of the public and private sector abroad, and you see the credit is much more than that, which means that part of the credit was used to finance investment abroad. If you go to London, the London real estate market is predominantly steered by Greek money. Greek investors play a particular role. Also in Berlin, the real estate market is influenced by Greek investors. So some of the rescue money really goes out immediately into other countries to buy assets there. And to see it relative to other numbers, this is 157% of GDP, the overall public credit Greece received. It's not the state credit, it's not government bonds. It is credit given to the banking sector, credit given to the government, everything together. Coming not from private investors, but from other public institutions. That is here in the middle. And that was 157% of GDP. Some people compare that with the Marshall Plan, which helped Germany after the war. This was accumulated over all the years, 5% of 1 year's GDP. Germany's GDP of the year of the London Debt Agreement, 1953. And so it means that we are talking about 31 Marshall Plans, which Greece has thus far already received from the community of states. And it has not helped, as you have seen, the rate of unemployment in Greece in the last 5 years has doubled, despite all that money, or I would say because of that money. What are the policy proposals? I think it is too late to carry out piecemeal reforms in Europe. We have to think of very radical moves. And the first is, and I know my German government does not share that view, is debt forgiveness. If a debtor cannot repay, then the creditor, I think, should face the truth and accept his fate and write off some of the debt. This is unpleasant, but it is unavoidable. Giving more credit to redeem the old credit and debt just means postponing the whole thing and increasing the overall exposure. It makes the losses in the end bigger rather than smaller. Then I think we need to reconstruct the euro such that we allow for temporary exits. If Greece exited the euro from the euro, it could devalue the drachma. Devaluation would mean that people would immediately stop buying these huge quantities of agricultural products abroad. They would go to their farmers and buy their products. And the farmers' business would expand and there would be more jobs among farmers. Then tourists would return from Turkey to Greece. And then third, rich people who tried to escape the country in the past would return and invest in Greece, buying cheap real estate. There would be a construction boom, and the economy would get going. IFO Institute has analyzed 70 cases of state bankruptcies after the war with devaluations that followed. And typically, rather stable was this result. The recovery began between 1 and 2 years after the devaluation. Think of the Asian crisis. All countries in Asia that went bankrupt devalued thereafter and recovered. And then we need harder budget constraints. The system where you can just print the money which you can't borrow is, I don't think, sustainable. János Kornai, the famous Hungarian economist, predicted the fall of communism with his illusion to loose budget constraints. And the policy which we have chosen now in the Eurozone is one of loose budget constraints. I don't think this is a viable basis for a future of the Euro. In the end, however, I am not saying that we should abandon the Euro. I think the Euro can recover. There is a problem. We have to see the problem and fix it, and then it can recover. And definitely we should go on with the European integration process. My institute also has made a proposal to develop Europe along the lines of Switzerland. Switzerland is a confederation that works with different cultures, different languages, and it's a workable model. But we should also see what makes this country workable. The same with America. It's a federation which works. But fundamental for such a federation is something which the Europeans seem to have forgotten, namely to have a common army. One speaks about rescue operations and insurances and so on and forgets the most essential thing for nation building, namely to put the armies together under one common European command, which is so self-evident in my opinion that everyone forgets speaking about it. But what we should not have in Europe is a system with debt mutualization. There are two models of running a federation, and this is my last point. The one is the debt mutualization model. Everyone stands in for each other's debt. You have bailout, which drives down the interest rates. The interest spreads disappear. Everyone can borrow at the same interest rate, but then the temptation for over-indebted countries to borrow more and more and more is huge, so you need political debt constraints like the Stability and Growth Pact or the Fiscal Compact. That's the European model. The other model is the self-liability model, which we have in the United States of America or in Switzerland. Self-liability means if a state goes bankrupt, it goes bankrupt, period. Which means that the creditors of that state do not get their money back. And since they know that they do not get their money back, they are very careful not to lend too much. If someone borrows too much, wants to borrow too much, the creditors say, no, you don't get the money. Or they charge very high interest rates. And this limits the amount of borrowing. California has been close to bankruptcy now for a decade. Illinois is close to bankruptcy. Minnesota is close to bankruptcy. If we implanted the European model to America, then the Fed would buy now Californian government bonds, because that's what the ECB did with Greek government bonds. But it doesn't do so. The Fed does not buy a single state bond of an American state. It buys the federal bonds, yes, but not the state bonds. So it does not come to help. Suppose what California would do if the Fed would buy Californian government bonds. They would issue more of them rather than tightening their debt. The same Switzerland. If a canton goes bust, it goes bust. And the creditors know that. Therefore, they do not lend much money to the cantons. This is the stability requirement. And it is also a stability requirement, by the way, for a private economy. If we don't have a bankruptcy law, it can never function. Because then a bankrupt firm can borrow as much as you wish. And it would burn the capital. The self-control of the capital market is essential for a federation to be able to operate. The United States had also tried it very differently in the first years. You know this person on the $10 banknote, Alexander Hamilton, the first finance minister. He, in 1791, mutualized the state debt, making it a federal debt. And he argued, well, this is cement for the new federation. We need it to stabilize the whole operation. Then in the Second War against Britain in 1813, there was a second round of debt mutualization. The result was that the American states thought, oh well, you can borrow as much as you wish. The debt burden is being lifted to the federal level. And they borrowed. There was a credit bubble. At first it looked nice. They built roads, canals, and things like that. So construction boomed. But most of the canals later were useless when the railways came. And the bubble burst in 1837. From 1837 to 1842, 9 out of 29 American states and territories went bankrupt. And the others were handicapped enough not to be able to assume the debt. So nothing but hassle and strife resulted from the debt mutualization strategy. Harold James, historian from Princeton University, said, the fiscal union proved to be explosive rather than cement, as Alexander Hamilton had thought, and he was drawing a direct line from 42 to 61 when the War of Secession began, not only because of the slavery problem, but also because of the unresolved debt problem. And only after the War of Secession did the Americans get their current model, the no bailout model. And when the European Maastricht Treaty was formed, in Article 125 of that treaty there was the no bailout clause. So one tried to mimic the American model, but one failed to implement it in the form of directives. And that is one of the reasons why we got the bubbles. Had investors known that there wouldn't be a bailout, they would not have brought the money to Southern Europe in the first place, there wouldn't have been the inflationary credit bubble, they would not have been deprived of their competitiveness, and there wouldn't be the mess of today. I think rather than reinventing the wheel here in Europe, we should try to mimic federations and confederations that work like the United States of America or Switzerland. Thank you very much for your attention.